Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to our friends out west. Welcome to the sixth session of the Queen's 2020 International Institute on Social Policy. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Margaret Biggs, and I will be your Queen's host today. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. We are very grateful to be able to learn on these lands. So for those who've been following us for the last week or two, as you all, and the premise for this conference is that this current crisis has exposed very stark inequalities, the precarious nature of work, and the lack of basic security for many. And this year we are hosting the conference as a series of moderated online sessions that explore the major social impacts of the current pandemic and economic crisis, the implications for critical building blocks of our social safety net, and recommendations for how Canada and other OECD countries can build back better. The presentations and videos from the first 5 sessions are posted now on the conference website. If you weren't able to join us, I encourage you to take a look at them. Last week, we had 3 terrific sessions that covered the underlying trends and major impacts of this crisis, and in particular, the differential impacts on sectors and occupations, age groups, gender, and racialized populations. This week, we are drilling down into 3 areas of public policy that are most implicated. On Tuesday, we had a terrific panel with Hilary Hoynes, David Green, and Miles Korak on rethinking income protection. And the discussion covered questions from basic income, employment insurance reform, expanded Canada benefits, workers' benefit, and many other issues. And yesterday, we focused on care, caregivers, and the care economy. And we heard from 3 top Canadian experts: Ido Penn, Andrea Doucette, and Samir Sinha. Today, the third of these policy drill downs, we're going to focus on rethinking labor protection. And there's no one really better to introduce and moderate this session than Armine Yalnizyan, who's the Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers at the Atkinson Foundation. Now, Armine's ears must have been burning yesterday because her work on how this crisis has disproportionately impacted women, their jobs, their care responsibilities, et cetera, was cited numerous times. Armine has an extensive bio and it's in the conference material, but let me highlight a few things. She recently served as the Senior Economic Policy Advisor to the Deputy Minister of Employment and Social Development Canada, and was Senior Economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Inequality Project from 2008 to 2017. She's an active and frequent commentator on TV, radio, and in print, and has really played a prominent role over the last 5 to 6 months, highlighting the impact of this crisis on women and marginalized groups. So welcome to Armine, over to you.
Hi, and thank you very much, Margaret, for introducing me so kindly. It really is an honor to be here, and particularly to be able to introduce these 2 great speakers that we've got with us. We really are in unprecedented times. Sorry to use the adjective, but we've never seen anything like this. Not only was this the first time that the world pressed pause on economic activity by design, it's the first time recessions have started with more women losing jobs than men, and the first time that men have picked up in the recovery more quickly than women. And those gender impacts really have a lot to do with what kind of labor protections we have, what we deem to be essential, what we don't deem to be essential, and what the future looks like as we move into the post-pandemic world, hopefully, that involves basically men and women in advanced economies anyway being equal participants in the labor market, whereas the protections don't equally protect them. So with no further ado, I think, if I can get this thing up in record time, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. I know Janine's work. Janine Berg is the Senior Economist at the International Labor Office in Geneva, Switzerland. And I've been following her work for quite some time. She knows about everything to do with the future of work, but a very remarkable perspective because most of us talk from our own bubbles of experience. Janine's bird's eye view, which is also an eagle eye, surveys the entire planet of labor. And it's a view that we absolutely need to hear increasingly at a time when we are dealing with a global pandemic and global responses that sometimes echo one another and sometimes do not. So we welcome Janine's international view of what we need to be thinking about in terms of labor protections in the early 21st century. And then we have, from the Canadian perspective, a remarkable speaker, Kevin Banks from Queen's University. He's the director of the Queen's Center for Law in the Contemporary Workplace. And I can guarantee you, you're going to be thrilled by the way he creates a really crunchy way for us to think about what the problems are now and how those problems give us sightlines on how to fix them. So I'm now going to turn over to Janine and ask her to kick us off on how we are going to deal with labor protections in the early 21st century and in a post-pandemic moment. Thank you. Over to you, Janine.
Thank you, Armine, and thank you, Margaret, and all of the other organizers of this really wonderful conference. I've tried to follow some of the other sessions and have really found it useful for my own work. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I wish I could be there in person and that it were a regular conference, but it's also nice to do it virtually. I'm just going to pull up my slides right now. I have been working at the ILO for nearly 2 decades now, really on the topic of labor market institutions, and most recently following changes in the world of work. In 2019, our Director General had a global commission on the future of work, and I was part of the secretariat of that. So I've been very involved in the debates about the transformation of work. And some of this transformation is certainly as a result of technology, but a lot of it is really changes in business organization and also regulatory changes. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we think about labor protection. There are a lot of gaps in labor protection in the world. This is a long-standing problem. It's even worse in developing countries. But what's been really interesting about this crisis is that these gaps in labor protection have come to the fore, especially with the discussions about essential workers. We realize how important these workers are, but yet many of these workers are the lowest paid in labor markets in many countries. So I just want to start with one slide, which is really that, most jobs are pretty ordinary. There is a lot of, talking about Elon Musk and computer programmers and very exciting professions, but really most things that people do are pretty ordinary. So this is just some data from the US, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This was data from 2018 on the 10 largest occupations in the United States. Retail salespersons, food preparations, cashiers, office clerks, registered nurses, laborers, so warehouse workers, computer service representatives, waiters, waitresses, general operations managers, and personal care aides. So here, the care economy. The red arrows are those occupations that are predicted to grow. So you'll see that some of the occupations, such as retail salespersons, have been affected by technology and are not predicted to grow. But nevertheless, it is still the top, or at least up until the crisis, it is the top occupation in the United States. Whereas STEM jobs are actually not that large of a percentage of the labor force. So in 2018, 6.4% of occupations were STEM occupations, and they were only predicted to increase to 6.7% by 2028, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I think this is something important to keep in mind, especially when we look at the changes in the world of work. What we've seen in countries is that, for several decades now, there's been what David Whale has called the fissuring of the workforce. So in our work at the ILO, what we've seen is really a rise in non-standard forms of employment. And what we're talking about here is really 4 different types. The first is temporary employment, so the use of temporary contracts. So depending on the legislation in certain countries will use temporary employment more. We also see the rise of part-time and on-call work. In some cases, new forms such as 0 hours contracts of people who don't have minimum hour guarantees. And other times, it's just kind of traditional part-time work. The rise of what we call it the ILO, multi-party employment relationships. This is your temporary agency worker or any sort of a really triangular employment relationship. In some countries, this is referred to as, labor brokers, for example. And then also the use of either disguised employment, so the misclassification of employment, so people who would be employees but are hired as independent contractors, or in some instances, the creation of a third category, such as in the case of Canada with the dependent contractors, so somebody who's not quite independent, still has a little bit of dependency, but is not an employee. Now, not all of this is a negative thing. There are many people who want to work part-time. There are many people who want to work in temporary employment contracts. But what we advocate at the ILO is that flexibility should be used because of the benefits of flexibility, and not to just make labor costs go down. Because when the objective is just to lower labor costs, what happens is that there's a deterioration in working conditions. And just to add to this, what we've seen, we've done some work recently on digital labor platforms, both the kind of in-person apps such as the Uber driver or the food delivery apps, but also crowdsourcing platforms. So the crowdsourcing platforms are basically a platform where a worker anywhere in the world can do the work, and then they submit it through the website of the platform. So this is actually a worker in India that we interviewed for a study that we did on microtask platforms. So for us, these digital labor platforms are the latest manifestation in what has been a decades-long fissuring of the workplace and a rise of non-standard employment. And what we also argue, and what we also see, that in many cases, although there is a fear about jobs being lost to automation, this was kind of the big debate in the past few years. It's changed a little bit, the debate now with COVID and the need to automate a little bit more. But what we're finding is not so much that workers' jobs have been lost to automation, but rather that the quality or the type of work has changed, or that the work has been displaced. So that means it could be that you're using the labor platform to send the jobs abroad, or that you're organizing the work differently through these labor platforms. And this also has a big impact on the quality of jobs. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of data, here's data from the OECD on temporary employment. As you can see, there's a big variation in the use of temporary employment across countries. We see Canada at around 12%. It rises. The Southern European countries have a higher use of temporary contracts. You'll see that in the UK, for example, it's less. In Australia, it's less, but that's also because there's also different forms of non-standard employment. So if you take the case of Australia, for example, there's a high percentage of workers who are casual workers, but not necessarily on temporary contracts. They're permanent casuals. They work fewer hours, for example. And then when you unpackage the data a little bit, you see what I discussed earlier, which is that it's affected really at certain occupations in the labor force, and many of these occupations that are what people will call less skilled or manual occupations. So this is just some data on the US occupations with the highest concentration of temporary agency workers. You'll see, for example, laborers, so warehouse workers nearly at 18.4%, production helpers, so this could be assembly line workers, for example, at nearly 30%, and other types of kind of professions that are lower skilled and easily replaceable work where there's a high use of temporary agency work. Now with the crisis, and this is not surprising, those workers who are on these temporary contracts or other forms of non-standard employment have been the ones that have been most likely to lose their job. So this is just some data that came out of a study from Oxford that's been tracking how people have been affected by the crisis in the US, the UK, and Germany. And there we see that, for example, if you look at the light purple purple and the dark purple, that people on temporary contracts were the first ones had a much higher probability of losing their jobs. This is not surprising. This is what you would expect. This is, this gives actually, businesses the flexibility that they need, but it's not a good thing for workers, for those workers, because not only are they more likely to lose their job, but those are the ones who are less likely to have the social protection coverage that they need, either because they may be excluded from the Social Security system because they didn't have enough contributory periods, or even if they do receive benefits such as unemployment insurance, it would be much less because of their kind of less, more intermittent work attachment, or labor force attachment. So it really has exposed this crisis of a lack of protection. And so for, what can be done about this? I mean, this is really the subject of today's session. We've been thinking, as I mentioned, for some time about how can we really, how can we ensure decent work for all? We recognize that there is a need for flexibility, that many people want different types of employment arrangements. So this is something that employees and employers, or workers and employers, might want, but we want to make sure that people, who are working part-time or who are working on a temporary contract do have all the same rights and benefits as workers who would be on what a traditional employment relationship or the standard employment relationship. So in the work that we've done at the ILO, what we've been arguing for is really the necessity to kind of have a multifaceted approach for addressing the needs of workers. So basically, there's two things, and yesterday's discussion was on basic income, and debates about or the day before, discussion on income support for people. What we recognize is that social protection is absolutely important. At the ILO, we advocate for a social protection floor, but we also recognize that that's just not enough. You need to have protection at the workplace as well. Even if everybody were to receive a really comfortable basic income, you still need people to work, and you want to make sure that when they're at work, that they're going to be protected from occupational and safety hazards, that they have voice at the workplace, that they can have a union, engage in collective bargaining, that they can have access to training and career opportunities, that they're not discriminated against, that they have an adequate wage, and that they have working hours where they're not just called them to work at the last minute. So there's a whole area of labor issues that need to be addressed regardless of what income supports are put in place. So for us, these two things go together. We also argue that even with kind of some sort of social protection floor, you still need to have some sort of system that is tied to the job as well, some sort of employee contributory Social Security system, which is actually more equitable than if you don't. Because if you just have a social protection system, what will happen, and no other benefits associated with work, what will happen will be that those that can will have private systems, and those who can't afford it won't. So it actually would be less equal. Okay, so basically what we say is that, the first main pillar is that you have to make the jobs better. So you have to make sure that there is equal treatment among the different types of contracts. So this means that whether the worker is part-time or temporary or from a temporary agency worker, that person should have access to the same rights and benefits as a worker who would be on a traditional employment contract. And by doing that, it ensures that then the firm is using that type of employment contract because of the flexibility needs that it needs, and not just because it's trying to lower labor costs and ultimately worsen labor conditions. So what we're saying is that we want flexibility. We want to allow flexibility. We want to have a kind of a diverse world of work, but we want to make sure that diverse world of work comes with the labor protections that are necessary. And then, of course, on top of that, you need to have the complementary social protection systems. You need to have this floor that would provide health benefits, for example, or old age benefits. And then, of course, you also need employment and social policies. I mean, we're very cognizant that you can have the most beautiful laws in the world, but if they're not supported with an economic environment that is going to create jobs and support industrial growth, that's not going to work very well either. So that's also another important component. So that's really our main point of view. And just to kind of explain this a little bit more, this is from a study that was put out by the Russell Sage Foundation. It's called Low Wage Work in the Wealthy World. It's now, quite old. It's from the mid 2000s, but it's actually one of my favorite books, because they basically, they took researchers from around the world who did the studies of different industries in different OECD countries. And so what they found is that, the jobs, these jobs were all affected by the same forces of globalization and technology, but the working conditions were very different. And they differed because of the legal systems in place and also the access to collective bargaining that these workers had. So just to give you an example, in France, you had a very high value added per worker, so that the productivity was not affected. The percentage of low wage workers, this is from the chapter on retail jobs, was very low. Turnover was very low. So these were actually, good jobs that people could have a living from. They have vacation benefits. They have all the health benefits they needed. And they have, they could have their schedule done in advance. And it was very different than the situation in the United States, for example, where people are told their schedule at the last minute and don't have any extra benefits. So there is a lot of room regardless of, the occupation, to have a different, to have better working conditions. And this is also from our study that we did on non-standard employment. This is the case of the Netherlands. I'll leave the box there for you for reference. But the Netherlands is a really interesting country because, several decades back, they had low female labor force participation. They wanted to increase it. So they changed their laws, and they really support the unions and the government work together to support part-time work. And so now, it's what's called actually the world's first part-time economy. There's a high percentage of the labor force. The majority of women work part-time, and many men, about 1/4 of men, work part-time. If you're a part-time worker, you have the exact same benefits as a full-time worker. And very importantly, if you work part-time, you have the right to switch back to full-time, and the business has to, if they can't accept it, they have to explain why. So the onus is on the business to say no, to explain why it can't accept you to switch to full-time. And this means that people aren't then stuck in part-time jobs. So from a gender perspective, this is actually a really important policy, because it means that, during certain periods of one's working life where you need to take care of children or take care of elderly parents, you can lower your working hours, still have the same rights and benefits, and then switch back when life allows you to. So this is the kind of policy that that we think is very beneficial. I mentioned in the beginning that the ILO last year had our Global Commission on the Future of Work, and we launched a report with some recommendations about the future of work. One of the recommendations, and this is very much in line with what I've been talking about, is about the need really for some sort of universal labor guarantee. So the idea is that all jobs, regardless of what they are, should have some sort of basic guarantees, kind of like a social protection floor. This would be a labor protection floor, you could think of it. So all workers should have access to freedom of association and collective bargaining rights. Occupational safety and health should be a fundamental right. Workers, if they fear that they're working into an unsafe work environment, they should be able to leave. This was something that, for example, in Bangladesh during the Rana Plaza disaster would have been a very important right and would have saved many lives. The right to a living wage. Time sovereignty, so this idea about flexibility and knowing your schedule in advance and having a voice in your scheduling, and also having more leeway, like I mentioned, in shifting between part-time and full-time, and of course the need for wage protection and dispute resolution systems. So I'm almost out of time, and I'm just going to end with this one quote. This is by the legal scholar Guy Davidoff, who says, you know, the concept of the employee is a legal construct. We do not find out who or what an employee, legally speaking, is. It is open for us as society to decide. I really like this quote. It's in a paper that he wrote about, you know, whether the employment relationship is dead, but I think it could be applied to everything. It's not about, you know, arguing whether the Uber taxi driver is an employee or not. It's about us as a society saying, what benefits, what rights do we want to give to these workers? And I think when you change the framework and you think of it from that perspective as what do we as a society want, what benefits do we want our essential workers to have, what rights do we want them to have, then that really reframes our thinking and hopefully can lead to a more just society. Thank you very much.
Wow, I want to always be on panels with Janine, because that was amazing, like right in on the money and a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. So no pressure, Kevin, but it's over to you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to take a moment to share my screen here. I want to pick up where Janine left off with the kinds of questions that she was asking, and think about my presentation is essentially about how should we be defining legally the relationships so that they can be regulated in a way that provides protection, the kinds of protections that really ought to attach to work relationships in light of our longstanding policy goals. Having a little trouble advancing my slides here. Okay, there we go. I'll begin with an outline of policy problems, then point to some gaps in workplace law, and finally try to lay out an agenda for policy reconsideration and response. Again, I have a bit of a lag in advancing my slides here. Okay, there we go. First, the policy problems. Canada is no stranger to the kinds of pressures that Janine was outlining on labor markets. We have fairly advanced reorganization of production, fissuring of production networks. We are subject to globalization, financialization, tech change. And so all of this has expanded precarious work and secondary labor markets in ways that make it more difficult to ensure decent and fair working conditions for many workers. And when I talk about secondary labor markets, I'm referring both to the expansion of precarious work relationships, so work relationships in which the future is uncertain, income is not secure, and the ability to enforce rights often is not secure either. And also precarious employers whose future income stream is unstable, whose profit margins may be thin. And particularly where those two things overlap, you have a series of policy challenges. You tend to find compliance and enforcement problems, coverage issues that are around whether workers are able to access the protections that they need, new forms of unfairness and barriers to full participation, and lastly, limited opportunities for the employment platform to deliver protections. Now, there's a second set of policy issues that arise as well, and these are around kind of macro distribution, and they've gotten a fair amount of airtime in policy and media circles in recent years. Largely, this is a long-term and I think deep systemic problem for countries like Canada, that so much of economic growth is ending up in the hands of so few. But it's also one that I think workplace and labor regulation has limited capacity to address. collective bargaining laws can still make a difference, but I think the key policy levers probably lie elsewhere. And it may be a bit much to ask collective bargaining to solve these kinds of problems. So my presentation is largely going to focus on possible responses to the first set of problems. How do we deliver decent work, especially to those who need legal protections the most? And so I'm going to focus on 4 gaps in workplace law. And I'm going to start with compliance gaps. Then I'll talk about gaps in coverage, gaps in the web of rules, and the shrinking of the employment platform. Now, I started with compliance gaps for a reason. I think if there was one thing that we could do, and in short order, that would make things better for a great many workers, it would be to improve the way that we secure compliance with the law. Non-compliance is a big issue. I have provided as an annex to my presentation a whole set of data points that kind of underpin what I'm saying. And among those data points are data taken from studies that show, for example, that when inspectors proactively inspect in Ontario, they uncover in 65 to 75% of cases employment standards violations. Now, those inspections tend to be targeted where employers are likely to be in violation. So I don't think you can extrapolate from that to a 60 to 70% non-compliance rate. But there are also surveys that tend to indicate that at least a substantial minority of employers are not compliant with employment standards, many employment standards. Now, the changes that brought about by fissuring and precariousness of employers and employees have made the compliance challenge bigger for those who are tasked with enforcing employment standards laws. On the employer side, employers are often smaller, may have thin profit margins. Employees who are precarious are much less likely to complain. Wayne Luchuk in a study published in 2013 found that precarious employees were 6 times less likely to voice concerns about occupational health and safety violations than employees who weren't in precarious employment relationships. So all of these things create challenges to enforcement, and not surprisingly, we see that to the extent that we have the data, non-compliance is higher in fissured industries like hotels, restaurants, and so on, where there's a higher use of outsourcing and temporary agency work. And we also see that reported non-compliance by workers is relatively high where workers are, for example, low wage or on temporary or short-term contracts. So the challenges have increased, and I'll say more about what we can do to address them. But I'm going to turn to coverage gaps. We're all familiar with the emergence of the gig economy. As Janine was saying, this is just a more recent manifestation of a long-term trend towards fissuring and precarious work. Now, some contract workers may fall outside of coverage, despite the fact that they're subject to the kinds of control and economic dependence that produce vulnerability very similar to that of employees. So, we think of the Uber drivers or Foodora delivery people. They seem to be subject to many of the same sorts of constraints on their ability to earn money and constraints on their income security that we tend to associate with employees. And yet it's because the contracts are such that their work is more casual, there's at least some doubt about whether they're employees or not. Now, that said, I tend to think more often the problem is confusion and time lags resulting from misclassification. There's litigation ongoing to determine whether, for example, Uber drivers are employees or not. But the common law test for employment tends to find that once there's sufficient control, even a casual employment relationship is a casual work relationship rather, is an employment relationship. And so more often the problem is one of misclassification, where the employer may be confused or may be deliberately misclassifying employees under the impression that it can simply structure the relationship how it wants to. Whereas employment law essentially stands for the proposition that if someone falls within its scope, you don't get to contract out of that. And often we have situations where, in fact, someone is within scope, but one or both parties are treating the relationship as though it's out of scope. The third set of gaps involves gaps in the web of rules. In Canada, we've seen in reviews of federal and provincial labor standards, parties come forward, representative groups, worker organizations, employers, and so on, make submissions about the issues that matter to them. They're very similar sort of list of issues to the ones that Janine was outlining that have arisen globally. What should be the rights of employees who are kind of on permanent temporary contracts, one sequenced after another, equal pay for part-time and temporary workers, eligibility requirements in order to enjoy employment standards protections, control over time. Can you refuse to be called in on short notice? Can you refuse overtime? Moving minimum wages towards living wages. Another set of issues that hasn't surfaced as much, but I think probably will, is the distribution of compensation within enterprises. Is there a relationship between CEO pay and the pay of the ordinary worker that ought to be the subject of public policy? We're a long way from getting a handle on that particular issue. Another set of gaps in the web of rules has to do with access to effective representation, unionization, or other forms of association and representation in the workplace. Now here, we have ample experience to demonstrate that precariously employed workers, especially short-term workers, are not likely to organize. And the reasons for this have to do with the kinds of procedural requirements and structures that our collective bargaining laws anticipate. Our model of collective bargaining essentially envisions the establishment of an exclusive bargaining agent with majority support and an intense bargaining relationship that requires a certain amount of commitment by the workers involved to set up. And if you're in a transient and casual situation, you're much less likely to engage with the effort and the risks involved in organizing. So as a result, those who would arguably benefit most from having their bargaining power enhanced in the workplace are least likely to access the tools to bargain collectively. Finally, there's the shrinking of the employment platform. We have fewer workers with pensions and benefits now. It's not surprising. The reasons have been well explored by Elizabeth Shilton in her work that's cited at the end of my presentation. If enterprises have less income stability and financial markets are providing less stability of returns, it's not surprising that fewer and fewer enterprises are willing to take the risk on a pension. Similarly, with accommodation of disability, the accommodation of disabled workers, the legal obligation to accommodate them varies according to the resources of the employer. And so if you have more employers who are themselves precarious, you're going to have less legal obligations, and I think also less accommodation in practice. And my research with Rick Chakowski and George Slotsky shows that there's a big gap, that about 35% of employed workers in this country say they are not getting accommodations that they need to work effectively. The pandemic has thrown a lot of these issues into sharper relief. I've highlighted some of the ways in which this is happening. I won't go into them in any detail because I want to get to the next part of my presentation, but I would commend the work of Catherine Lepel in particular, who's begun to excavate the ways in which occupational health and safety laws are failing to protect those who most need protection at this time. All right, so here's an agenda for policy reconsideration and response. Couple of things to say about this. I think these provide a fairly complete response to the first set of policy issues that I identified, but as I noted earlier, are not a complete response to the second set. I would also say that research has provided a sufficient basis to move forward on items 1 to 3 in this list, but more research is needed into items 4 and 5 in the Canadian context at least. So let me turn to the first item, moving towards proactive compliance and enforcement. This was the first set of recommendations by Michael Mitchell and Justice John Murray in the Changing Workplaces Review in Ontario, and they outline a pretty complete strategy. It also reflects many of the strategies that were included in the Federal Labor Standards Review Commission's report back in 2006. Now, the essence of this is to move away from a complaint-driven model where labor law enforcement agencies are essentially in the business of providing client service, responding to complaints, following up on them, investigating, and trying to provide a remedy. Those who've researched what's needed to improve compliance are pretty much unanimous that that is not effective. Why? Because many workers don't complain or complain only after the employment relationship is ended. It doesn't proactively detect violations, and it's not effective in deterring violations. So, a complete strategy involves building awareness so that those who are out of compliance due to lack of information are properly informed, so that industry associations are engaged in order to help their members understand what their legal obligations are, and encourage a level playing field for all of their members. But in addition to that, there will be a group of employers who are incentivized not to comply. And it's important to gather compliance data, use it strategically, and proactively inspect in order to, like a law enforcement agency, in order to detect and deter non-compliance. And when you find deliberate non-compliance, to use deterrent sanctions. Now, all of that needs to be supported by expeditious adjudication of appeals in order to ensure that it's procedurally fair. And I would say that for those who are considering this sort of reform, it requires rethinking resources. In order to be proactive, additional resources may need to be allocated. And in addition, perhaps inspectorates will have to be able to say to people, look, we're not going to inspect in response to every complaint that we get. We will prioritize, and you'll have access to an affordable mechanism. Clarify and expand coverage. I see I'm running low on time, so I'll summarize here. There are problems with the definition of employment that we have inherited from the common law. Essentially, when we define employment, we look to things like control and dependence. The notion of control has evolved largely out of the feudal master and servant relationship into a more modern setting, but it still lags behind with respect to the kinds of controls that we now see exercised through algorithmic platforms that surveil and rate workers. Our legal analysis tends to get bogged down into a multi-factor test, which aims to try to figure out, is this relationship like the old common law employment relationship enough that we can call it employment? And that's not really the question anymore. The question is now, I think, is the person actually an entrepreneur? Is that person in business for him or herself? And if not, then that person needs protection and should be considered an employee. If we continue with the old multi-factor tests, we provide too many opportunities to litigate and challenge, and too much. And the complexity of the test also causes confusion. So there are a couple of ways to deal with this. We could refocus the common law test in a way that the Supreme Court of Canada has already suggested, by asking as a threshold matter, is there any significant opportunity for profit through negotiated rates of pay or control over costs or not? And if not, maybe that person should be an employee. The Supreme Court states that as the central test in an important case called Sagas, but then lists a whole set of factors which are more traditional and I think tend to muddy the waters. So maybe legislative intervention to sharpen the focus is called for. Another way to do it might be to let go of the idea of a single test and create multiple purpose-driven ones. We already have this to some extent. In collective bargaining law, for example, dependent contractors are treated as employees. In defining who the employer is, in occupational health and safety law, a whole range of different actors outside of traditional employers have legal responsibilities and obligations to workers. And that's driven by the purpose of the legislation. So we could move away from a one-size-fits-all approach. I've given some examples in the annex to my presentation. Three last items, which since I'm out of time, I won't dwell on. I think we're in a position, as Janine was saying, to expand employment standards. Globalization does not provide a reason not to do this. And there is scope for regulation to address fairness issues. More thinking needs to be done about making union representation more available and accessible in secondary labor markets, and some of the literature that I cite here has begun to do that thinking. I'd be happy to talk to it speak to you about it after I'm done. And finally, again, as Janine was emphasizing, we need to take another look at our income security apparatus. And I note that some of the developments that have taken place in the course of this pandemic have highlighted income security issues and caused us to experiment, at least in a temporary way, with ways to improve security. So there you have it. I will stop now. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Fabulous presentation. And you've left us hanging on your words for more. But I'm going to start off with the privilege of being the moderator to ask each of you a question. And while I'm asking that question and you are answering that question, each one of you, I'm going to invite the audience to chew on what they've heard and decide what they would like to have our incredible guests addressed. So my first question is going to go to Janine. And you have, it was really striking that one of your first charts that showed what are the top occupations and what are the fastest growing ones, that was a highly gendered list, where a lot of the jobs that are the top jobs happen to be, and in fact, 6 of the 10 jobs that you had listed there that are growing the fastest also happen to be female dominated. And yet, the pandemic was the she-cession all around the world. More women lost jobs than men. How do you think the she-cession and prospects for she-covery might affect our capacity to protect workers and create great jobs in the wake of COVID? And when you're done, I'll ask you a question too, Kevin, giving our audience a chance to think about it.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that this crisis, I know if there is a silver lining, is that there is more of a respect for these feminized occupations. Too often there's been a long history of women having difficulty accessing the labor market because of, domestic responsibilities and care responsibilities. And so when they do access it, they tend to access it into occupations that are, highly sex segregated and don't have the same rights and benefits. So there's a lot of reasons as to why these occupations aren't as well paid and don't have all the labor protections that are needed. So hopefully with this crisis, there's been two things. One, that a lot of women have lost their jobs, but also that a lot of women are in essential jobs, such as, they're the tellers at the grocery store that we still need to go to the grocery store. They're the nurses that are in the hospitals. They're the school teachers who are doing the online schooling. So, you really see how they're being affected. So hopefully, if I can, two things that would come out of this that would be good would be, one, a realization that we have to protect all jobs and that we have to upgrade conditions for workers. Especially you had the panel yesterday on care economy. This is such an important area of work, and it's not just in Europe and North America, across in Asia, in many parts of the developing world. The care jobs are going to be the most important jobs. So the really, if we can turn care jobs into decent jobs, into really good jobs, we have a much better society. And you see this in the Nordic countries because these jobs are well treated and well paid and so forth. So that's one issue. But then we also need to be reflecting a little bit on this idea of, can all of us really, is it realistic for everybody to be working, 40 hours a week, full time, without any breaks, and yet we're supposed to still have families and care for our families? So that we have to call in question a little bit this model that we have. We want women in the labor force, but not everybody should be in 40-hour or more our job. So maybe there needs to be a little bit of a rethinking too about, more access to leave, a greater ability for workers to come in and out of the labor force without being too hurt by that. And what I was talking about with the Netherlands, this part-time employment that's good quality employment. If we could all be working 30 hours a week in well-paid and good jobs, we would have a much better society.
Thank you so much for such a thoughtful answer. And I'm sure we're going to be diving into some elements of this again. When I was listening to Kevin, and you both mentioned the growing unstandardization of work, which I guess loops a little bit into what you were talking about, like the fetishization of working all the time. It seems like a bad thing when people can't work all of the time. And yet, of course, that's one of the attractive features of non-standard work, is that you can call the shots a little bit more. For some people can call the shots a little bit more on their time, which is our truly universally allocated resource. 24/7, that's all any of us have got. So Kevin, given that around the world, growing non-standardization of work has been accompanied by the falling labor share of income everywhere. I'm wondering if, and in response to that, the establishment institutions like the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank have been calling for agendas that involve more inclusive growth. I'm wondering, with the agenda that you set, if you would place a priority on one cluster of elements that could actually improve labor's lot more than others. Is there something you would say, like, of your agenda, is there some bucket of measures that you would prioritize as first order? We must get to this first and foremost.
Right. So it depends what you mean by labor's lot. So if we're talking about the labor share, the broad scale distribution issue, as I was saying, I don't think that there's a full answer to be found in workplace regulation. I think as a matter of priority, consider the minimum wage issue, address the issue around access to meaningful collective bargaining, which I think is a very complex issue, and we've only begun to scratch the surface of in Canadian jurisdictions. And then thirdly, maybe think about, does it make sense to have rules around the ratio between senior executive pay and the pay of the workforce? And I know that's a controversial and somewhat ill-defined suggestion, but it's now starting to circulate. And it corresponds to ideas of distributive justice that are widely shared in our society. So those are the things I think about, but I think we need to look outside of workplace law at things like corporate governance, the way the tax system incentivizes CEO and senior executive pay, and maybe, to what extent our institutional setup favors fissuring as opposed to more inclusive enterprises. So those are some initial thoughts in response to that question.
Absolutely excellent response, actually. And part of what we're talking about when we're talking about labor protection is the bargaining power to be able to effectuate your own protection. We have so many good questions. One of the first ones to arise from this group has been a question about portable benefits, and if it could help non-standard workers more. And I guess I would ask Janine to answer the question about portable benefits, because I'm sure it depends on the ability to pay by workers. So many non-standard workers are just eking out a living. And if you're going to have portable benefits, who pays for those benefits? So I'm just wondering if you've got some diverse opinions from what's been going on around the world on how we protect non-standard workers. Actually, if you have an idea on how to answer that too, Kevin, please weigh in. I'm just going to try and get through 5 or 6 questions in the next 1 minute. Do we actually have 1 minute? I should know the answer to this question, but go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So the debate that I've heard mostly about portable benefits has come from the United States. So I'm not sure how it's being framed in Canada. In the US, I find that it's a bit of a red herring because Social Security is a portable benefit. If you have, you can have multiple jobs and both those jobs will be contributing into the Social Security system. You move to another job and you would still get the benefits from the contributions you made in your previous job. So I get a little bit worried when I hear that term because I feel like it's distracting a bit from the big issue. What I would advocate more would be that the Social Security system needs to be expanded to include things such as paid sick leave, vacation leave, health insurance. So it would be a much more encompassing Social Security system. And then you have that in many parts of the world. You have that in Brazil. I think the French system was a little bit different, but you have that some aspects of that as well. So it's not that, but we definitely want to have benefits that are portable, and one of the areas that really needs to be worked on is, for example, for people who go from self-employment to employee status, people who move back and forth, there needs to be Social Security systems that allow kind of a smooth transition. And so whatever contributions you're making into a system, that then it be, you could transition. But I think what's really important is that the system be something that that it's one system that the employer is paying into, the worker is paying into, and then regardless of the job that they're doing or of their change in if they change jobs, they could still have access to it.
So I substantially agree with what Janine was saying. Harry Arthur's made a proposal in his 2006 report for the Federal Labor Standards Review Commission that we consider the idea of a benefits bank. And this was a big idea, but not a very sharply defined one. He didn't have the time or the resources to fully explore it. I've thought about it since then. It strikes me that it's very difficult to coordinate the private provision of benefits in a way that assures continuity. There are reasons why benefits are limited through private contractual arrangements. Elizabeth Shilton has explored those in detail. Only 25% of Canadians now have access to a pension. the percentage of people who have benefits is surprisingly low. So I think the solution, simpler, more direct, lies in expanding CPP, making sure that the public healthcare system provides the needs of people, including perhaps drug protection, prescription costs, and then maybe having a look at EI and see, can that fill in some of the gaps with respect to sick leave that are now very evident as a result of the pandemic.
So there's a really good question that came up from the audience, and I'm having trouble reaching it, so I'm going to ask you a different question. Do you think that, both of you, please answer this, because of this shift that's moving? I mean, you approached it in a kind of interesting way, Janine, talking about how maybe we're fetishizing paid work too much, that all we should be doing is doing paid work. And being able to move in and out of the labor market more fluidly is, of course, a function of labor protections and basically the social wage, what supports you when you are not taking care of yourself. But do you think that creating more limitations on this flexibility that is offered and putting those policies in place could actually eliminate the workplace practices that increase flexibility for time? And I wonder if both of you could weigh in on that. Do you see any trade-off there?
I'm not sure I really understood the question. So whether, if we have limits on flexibility, whether it would affect flexibility for time? I'm sorry.
So my understanding was the question as phrased is, could policies to protect these type of workers actually eliminate the type of work that people actually want? So I'm not sure what that person had in mind, but do you see any trade-off there?
Okay, I see what you mean. No, I think actually it's the contrary. I think these flexible work arrangements would be used for their flexibility and not for other reasons. So I think if you allow people to work part-time and to choose their hours, right? If they have that right to set their hours, within a certain limit, right? But if they have some sort of margin, there will be people who would want to work more hours, and there will be people who want to work less hours. And you can also create jobs if you have fewer people, people working fewer hours. So I think that that's not really so much of a problem with the temporary work as well. There are some people who want to work for certain periods, and you could still have temporary agency work that places you. It doesn't mean that those jobs would disappear. What you would see in many cases, for the data that I showed on the United States for temporary agency workers, what we find is, basically about 50% of temporary agency workers are in, blue collar manual jobs, assembly lines, warehouses, and they're just rotating. And they can't join the trade union. They can't voice, God forbid they voice some sort of complaint, because then you just call the temporary agency and that's it. They'll tell you not to come in the next day. So if you have put these protections in place, it means then that many of those jobs would actually become permanent jobs, and people would have the stability that they need. The job wouldn't disappear. But that doesn't mean that during the Christmas season they wouldn't hire temporary workers, because they actually need temporary workers for the Christmas season. So I don't see it that way.
Excellent response. Thank you. And thank you for the question. Another question from the audience, and I am reading. My understanding is that small businesses represent a larger share of the economy in Canada than in other countries. Is the size of the small business sector a problem in advancing your agenda? And that's for Kevin. Particularly about small business, often the reforms that you and many of us are talking about seem to butt up against the issues that are raised and approaches that are favored by small businesses. Should standards be applied equally to all employers, or would a specific approach to smaller firms be appropriate?
Okay, that's a great question. I tend to think the default is that they should apply to all businesses. There may be some situations in which it's appropriate to vary the standards. But the main reasons for these standards have to do with the dignity and well-being of the workers. And our standards in Canada, our approach historically has been less onerous than what you tend to find in many European jurisdictions. So I think we do have some room to maneuver there. A lot of small businesses are also not in international markets. The essential competitive question, is this going to disadvantage businesses to the extent that they reduce employment, really depends on whether or not there's a level playing field. And if you're able to strengthen compliance and ensure that all businesses are playing by the same rules, then they will adjust. And it may be that some jobs get made permanent because employers need to invest more in employees in order to make it worth their while to apply those standards to those particular workers. But that's just a change in business model or strategy, and one which may in fact benefit both the employer, the worker, and the overall productivity of the economy in the long run. I overheard someone who runs a bike shop locally here talking about what's had to happen in his business since the minimum wage went up. And he said, look, I can't afford the turnover anymore. If I'm paying people at that rate, they need to know what they're doing, and I can't keep training them. So he was moving to a different model in which he attempted to recruit and retain people and train them. That's probably a good model for everyone involved.
There's always a trade-off between productivity and investment of time and what we pay for the things that we get. I'm going to now move to another audience question. Last year at the same conference, David Green, who is an academic from BC, finished his presentation asking if there are any ways we could increase labor's share of GDP. And after his presentation, someone suggested maybe mandating worker representation on corporate boards might be an interesting policy. Have either of you two reflected on such an idea? That is, what kind of worker voice is built into the system? Janine, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a really good observation. In Germany, you have the work councils where you have worker representatives on the boards. You see this also in the Nordic countries. And you tend to have practices instituted in those corporations that not just are more worker friendly, but that tend to promote productivity and a lot of investment in training, everything that we've really talked about. I think that this is a good policy, especially, we've moved to this kind of shareholder capitalism over the past few years, which has really been problematic because many of the decisions that are being made are not just bad for workers, but bad for the company over the long term. And workers have, it's in their best interest for the companies to succeed. So if there can be more worker voice about what can be done to improve the competitiveness of the company or to make it more, dynamic, efficient, or innovative, those are very good things. And it can also, stymie some of the concerns that Kevin was talking about really high executive compensation and so forth. So I think that that's something that is a very good governance model that would be helpful.
Kevin?
Yeah, just to add briefly to that, the research seems to indicate that one of the big reasons for the shift in the Anglo-American world towards higher executive compensation, and it's a much more marked shift than you find in other parts of the advanced economies, has to do with the change in internal norms to firms and to the business community more generally. And I suspect that in countries like Germany, giving workers voice at the board of directors level has an influence on corporate culture and the norm structures of enterprises, and probably exerts a moderating influence on executive pay as well.
Here's a related question in terms of voice and being able to actually get voice. And the question is from Ushnish Sengupta, and it goes like this: with respect to organizing, and the slide that you had, Kevin, but I know you've also talked about this, Janine, and the alternative modalities of organizing voice to unions. Is there data on workers forming their own organizations, such as cooperatives, as part of the economic recovery? Is this part of the way people are starting to organize? I find it an interesting question because of what we've been seeing recently with respect to really important wins for delivery workers, for Uber, Lyft, and other platforms, in the opportunity to at least be able to form collective voice and try and negotiate with their overlords.
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, please start with it. But I would also like to ask Kevin if there's data in Canada or anywhere around the world. So both of you, please, internationally as well as in Canada.
Okay. We have a database on trade union representation. It's a very tricky data to collect. Certainly official trade union data is difficult, but then other forms of worker organization or worker association, that's really hard to record. But just to talk a little bit about trends, in general, in crises, we see, and we saw this, for example, in the Argentine crises of the early 2000s, a real movement towards worker cooperativism, you know, sometimes with the factories going bust, but the workers go in and they actually restart the factory, took over the factory, and there were some really dynamic cooperatives that started. There is an exciting movement about platform cooperativism. You know, the internet and the platforms that have been developed, they could very much be a cooperative model, and they would work very well. And that would, you know, if everybody could get a little piece of the pie, that would really solve a lot of the problems. Unfortunately, it's hard to compete when there's venture capital that's subsidizing prices and so forth, but that's a different topic. So the short answer is I don't have the data. We don't have the data. It's very hard to collect, but it is true that you do see in times of crises more of an interest in forms of worker association. And I think even in this crisis, certainly the relevance of trade unions has become really important for workers who are concerned about their safety and health at work. That's an area that trade unions have been particularly strong on and advocating for during this crisis. Yeah,
so I'm not aware of any systematic data on worker cooperatives in this country. Anecdotally, you know, you do hear about attempts to reconfigure failing businesses as cooperatives, you know, to save jobs, for example. It's a challenge. You know, it's interesting that cooperatives take hold in such a challenging environment, and that may be part of the reason that their spread has been limited too. With respect to other forms of representation, there isn't a lot of data either. You know, Daphne Terrace has done some good work on non-union representation within firms. It often tends to be employer-led, so it's not really the same thing. And we know, again, anecdotally, that industry-level representation structures have been coming apart in this country, where there, you know, at one time there was pattern bargaining in many industries. Those were voluntary arrangements, and they've kind of fallen on hard times in many places. So, you know, the thinking, to the extent that we got into it in the Changing Workplaces Review, I was an academic advisor to Michael Mitchell and John Murray around alternative forms of representation and industry level bargaining, was that it would probably need some sort of legal support if it was to take hold. But I guess the last thing I'd say is, we as a labor relations community are reluctant to engage, I think, both on the union and employer side. And there's a concern that it may destabilize the model, the current model that we have, which works reasonably well for those who have access to it. But my concern, and the reason I flagged it in my presentation, is that the base for that model continues to shrink. And it's really not available to a lot of the people who need it the most. So at some point, we need to find a way to make available to other workers some other model without threatening the existing one.
Right on. So apropos of the shrinking group of people who have protections and the stories we're reading everywhere, here's another question about Deliveroo, which actually, and the gig economy, whether it's in food or whatever it's in. And a reflection that, in fact, Deliveroo itself recently left Ontario due to the threat of new labor laws. And that has happened where Uber has basically threatened to leave California because of the AB5 law. So these companies are threatening to leave because of the laws, because of the new labor laws. And it's not just intransigence on the part of big companies with lots of money backing them, just like Janine said. There's a huge taste for the services these companies offer by consumers, just like the problem we had with the Rana Plaza fire. People like cheap t-shirts, just like when Netflix was told by CRTC to pay taxes, and there was a hue and cry from customers who didn't want to see their monthly price go up in Canada because Canada didn't charge taxes on Netflix. So you've got this push and pull. It's not just the employer and the employee issue and those tensions, but the consumer that wants faster, better, cheaper, more convenient. So how do you both think about balancing public demand, labor rights, and good jobs? Janine, do you want to give it a go first, since you've been around the mulberry bush here on the Rana Plaza stuff and everything else?
Right. I mean, you have to have some sort of basic guarantees, and if that means that you're going to have to pay 15 cents more for your T-shirt, well, then so be it. I mean, there are, people need to be sure that if they're, delivering food for you at their door and they have a car accident, that they can, their hospital bills will be covered and that they have some sort of protection. There have to be some sort of minimum guarantees, regardless of what they're doing. I get very concerned sometimes with some of these big companies because I feel like they're maybe exploiting some of the consumer sentiment and driving it up and making perhaps a bigger deal of it than it is. If the services are really needed and the companies leave, there will be other companies or cooperatives that can come in that can offer the service, and they can offer it in a way that's friendly to the workers. So I don't think that policymakers should be too concerned when the big companies threaten to leave. I think, if the service is really needed, the market will find a way to provide it. And if the law then says that it has to be under these conditions, well, then it'll be under those conditions. And if it can't be provided under those conditions, well, then it shouldn't be provided. There are certain basic, protections and decency that we need in the world of work. So that's one thing. But then, there's also some of the things that the companies have done that it hasn't really been, in my view, and here I'm speaking personally, not representing the ILO, very ethical. Where I did my undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin, they just wanted to have fingerprint the drivers to ensure that, do a criminal background check on the Uber and Lyft drivers to ensure that they didn't have, records, and that they were, safe people that would be picking you up in their cars to take you around. And they had a massive campaign against this. When the voters voted for it, they left. This was something that is a very minimum safety standard that a municipality wanted to put in place, and yet they left over. They eventually came back. But I just don't think it's really good behavior, and I think that there are minimum laws and they need to be respected.
Kevin, you want to give it a crack at how do we balance these three sets of issues?
So I mean, everybody likes cheap stuff. We all like to get stuff that we don't have to pay for. But companies, like many of these companies, aren't making money. No, the only reason they're afloat is that venture capitalists keep pouring money into them. Their delivery services don't make money. And so essentially, if people are enjoying cheap delivery services, it's in a non-sustainable way. I think those costs have to be internalized. You shouldn't be able to, as Janine was saying, get cheap stuff by exploiting people. So, at an economic level, I think that's the analysis. The legal questions often turn out to be really straightforward. Uber's been losing cases, and not by a close margin. The judgment in California was very clear that Uber's arguments were largely preposterous. And there's been a similar judgment in the UK. Now, they depend on the particular legal tests of the jurisdiction. It may be that Uber's arguments are not as preposterous in this country. They may even be viable. But the question is, does the law apply to these people? And if it does, it has to apply. To me, there's no reason why an outfit like Uber should get an exemption just because it's a cool technology.
But again, back to the popularity and like the hue and cry that comes up from the angry mobs in the street that want their Uber because it's cheaper, faster, and more convenient. I have time for one more question. Your questions have been fantastic. We see you, we see your questions, and we will be thinking about what you've been asking. I'm going to do one more question that's jamming together two of them. So it goes like this. The income security folks on Tuesday at this conference said transfers could not do it alone, I suppose, make the world a better place for workers. And advances had to come through labor protections. And now you folks are saying, you speakers, Janine and Kevin, are emphasizing the limits of change through labor protections and referring to income security programs. So this first part of the question says, are we stuck? And then somebody said almost immediately thereafter, what about considering bold solutions like open borders and a 15 or 20-hour work week, as John Maynard Keynes predicted in 1930. So are we stuck? What is the way forward? Is it time for big picture ideas or actually trying to drill down on the things that create level playing fields for everybody, businesses and workers alike? Janine, take it away.
Okay, no, so I think actually what I was trying to say was complementing really the message from the income protection discussion. You need both. You need income protection or social, we could call it social protection, minimum income, however it could be. It can take multiple forms depending on the country. You need some sort of basic level of protection, and you need some sort of social security systems, but you also need the labor protection, and they go hand in hand. Because if you don't have labor protections, you put too much pressure on the social security or social protection systems. So by having labor protections, you take off some of the pressure of the social protection systems. And so they really reinforce each other. The difficult part is, how to build up the labor protections in those parts of the area of work where there's gaps. Either there's gaps in the law, or as Kevin was saying, very importantly, there's a lot of gaps in compliance. And it's much harder to enforce, certain labor protections when people are working through a third party triangular employment relationship, or if they're working kind of asocial hours, or if they're working temporary contracts. And so it's much harder to enforce. And that's what makes it difficult. But no, the two definitely complement each other. So I don't think we're stuck, but it just means that we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that to do a lot of homework to put this all into place, and a lot of political will to put this all in place. That's really what's most needed. Now, as far as the question on the 15 to 20 hour work week, this is, I don't know if we're ever going to get to a 15 to 20 hour work week, but I speak my own personal views. I really do think that, it is time for us to rethink a little bit some of the way we have been thinking about the world of work. We wanted women to go into the labor force, and you have now women in the labor force. Everybody's everybody who was lucky enough is working, but it's not a realistic scenario. And yet at the same time, there's also demands to improve skill, or people want to change, or they have other things that they want to do in life, and we should be able to do other things in life. So I think we need to think a little bit more about how we could redesign employment, for our changing needs as a society. In the about 10-15 years back, the European Commission had an expert group that published this. It was called the Supiot Report, and it was this idea that people would be able to take these breaks and come in and out of the labor market more easily. How do we set up some sort of benefit system that would allow that, an employment insurance system that would allow you to take leave to go care for family or to go do training. So I think we need to be a little bit more creative on how we develop these systems. And then, and ultimately that could lead to more people engaged in the labor market, maybe not engaged for as many hours and maybe going in and out, but more people engaged. And you see that today in Sweden, for example. You have a lot of people who take leave and go in and out. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Kevin, you want to take a run at this question?
Sure. So the first piece, are we stuck? I don't think so. We've seen fairly substantial increases in the minimum wage in recent years. I did a study looking at changes in employment standards and labor laws from about 2002 to 2011. Most of them were pro-employee and responsive to, in a measured way, to public sentiment. The changes that are outlined in my agenda and the kinds of things Janine is talking about are a little more substantial than those. But I think if people remember how we got the underpinnings of the middle class in the mid-20th century and have a vision of what they might look like in the 21st century, political mobilization may get us where we need to go. Shorter work week. I tend to think maybe more flexible work weeks are a better answer. I liked the slide that Janine put up about the Netherlands. I think that's an interesting model to explore because I just think it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all approach to that kind of an issue. And then open borders. Well, that's, let me suspend the political impossibility of that in the present context and ask, I think the deeper question about opening up borders is, can we do anything to help the political situation in some of the sending countries? Because, a flood of economically desperate people into our country risks a big increase in the supply of labor that could undermine some of the underpinnings of our institutions. But on the other hand, open borders might put some pressure on the politics of other countries, let's say in Central America, for example, to treat their workers better. But it's hard to see that we're going to get to open borders anytime soon.
Fabulous answer. By the way, your answer about flexibility in shorter work hours reminds me of a task force that I was part of in 1993 for Lloyd Axworthy on reducing and redistributing working time. And exactly what you said, like basically shorter work time can take place in the form of shorter hours, more leaves. It could be a shorter work life. And you redistribute the work that is available by so doing, which is what we were worried about when we had over a decade of a very, very high unemployment. So our time is almost done. I have to hand the torch back to Margaret, but may I just say to KISP, you guys need to have a session next year on the Big Bang ideas going forward in the early 21st century, because that very last question, I think we could have probably talked for half an hour just about what else could we be doing other than income support and labor protection, and what are we likely going to need to do in the context of now, once we get through the pandemic, we're going to be looking at decades of the impacts, the very unequal impacts globally of population aging, and the big push and pull of needing more people and needing more economic opportunity where everybody's going to be on the move for sure. So I look forward to whatever it is you do next year. And I thank all of you on the audience who have been part of this conference, that paid attention to the income security one, that are participating so actively here. And to echo a little bit of what Janine was talking about, maybe, and actually what Kevin was talking about too, maybe what we're talking about in the coming years is not just a full employment agenda, but a full engagement agenda. And I hope to fully engage with you over the course of the next few years to get there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to moderate this terrific session.
Well, thanks very much, Armine. It was a great session. Thank you to Janine and Kevin for giving us so much to think about, both broad but also very detailed comments and recommendations. It was a really rich discussion and great questions from the audience. I know we left some in the box there that we couldn't get to, the panel couldn't get to, but thank you very much for your engagement. So and interesting linkages back to the earlier sessions this week around the care economy, social protection, and income protection. So again, as I think Janine said, these are not either ors, or one is necessary but not sufficient. So we have to think about them in a complementary way. So we're going to continue next Tuesday. On Tuesday, we're going to focus on rethinking fiscal arrangements in Canada. This is a fairly big bang idea, Armine. So COVID has generated massive pressures on health and social services and big fiscal deficits at all levels of government, and calls for higher standards and greater coverage for services. So there's an amalgam of issues here around the fiscal arrangements that underpin our social safety net. And these pressures coming from the crisis are being layered on top of other frictions that have been related to equalization and shocks to the energy dependent provincial economies. So lots of issues here. And as a result, you know, there are questions being asked about how robust our fiscal arrangements are here in Canada. So next Tuesday, we're going to have two leading scholars speak to these issues. We're going to hear from Daniel Bailin, who's the James McGill Professor and Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, obviously at McGill, and Robin Bodway, who's a Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics at Queen's University, long-standing leading scholar around the fiscal arrangements. And the panel is going to be moderated by Jennifer Robson, who's a leading social policy commentator and scholar in Canada, who's a professor at Carleton University. So please join us. It's going to be a great session. Look ahead, look at the conference program. We have 3 really terrific wrap-up sessions next week. Please sign on using that unique URL that you were given in your confirmation email when you registered. This is the same link you used today, and you can use it again Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week. So before closing, again, I'd just like to acknowledge again that we have some tremendous sponsors to pull this conference off: Employment and Social Development Canada, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services in Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Hope to see you all next Tuesday.